Welcome back to Faith, Frauds, and Falsehoods, where we explore the various cults and religions of the world. Tonight, we're continuing, our discussion on the Institute and Basic Life Principles. Hey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to help others find us.
Awesome. And before we get started, right, as always, these are our opinions and not necessarily those of our church and employers. So, Matt, let's talk about the expansion and growth of Institute and Basic Life Principles. How's that sound?
Yeah. Hey, listen, we talked last episode about the origins of it.
Mm-hmm.
So this episode, we're going to talk about expansion and growth. They really expanded.
They did. Yeah. There's a lot of key dates. They most of it's all on their website, right? Of where it comes from.
They actually have a really cool thing at the bottom of the website with a timeline that kind of just picks through the whole thing. They're quite proud of that, and I see why. So let's start about 1964. What happened in 1964?
Yeah. Well, so remember in 1961 is when they were founded as campus teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
The high school youth, teenager oriented group. And in 1964, Bill Gothard was invited back to Wheaton, where he had been a student, to speak to youth in a lecture titled Basic Youth Conflicts. I don't know necessarily this was his first lecture. I wouldn't assume so, right? If he was being invited. But this was really the one I think that kicked it off for him.
Well, remember this is 1964. There's a lot of turmoil in our country, a lot of things happening. It's interesting how we keep coming back to cults that were formed around the same time.
Right.
A lot of religious stuff was happening around this same time. Denominations that both you and I work with were formed around this same time. So that's always interesting. I always end up bringing that up in our episodes that, all that same time period where things was happening. But so what was happening is he went and did this lecture, and it was popular, very popular. They actually brought him back and wanted to do more of this. There had a lot of people who wanted to bring their friends to come listen to it. A lot of students and a lot of people wanted to bring their students to this, So this was Basic Youth Conflicts. This was how to live life as a Christian, basically. Right?
Yep.
That's the basic gist of what he was teaching.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And
so in 65, they turned this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say by 65, it turned into a formal seminar with hundreds of students attending at a time, where they focused on tracing the conflicts in relationships to the violation of basic principles that were found in scriptures and providing them with actionable steps to take to fix those conflicts.
Yeah, they started traveling around the country doing these things. At churches, at Christian colleges, at coliseums sometimes.
Yep.
There could be thousands of people come to some of these seminars. He was very Billy Graham-esque, not quite the same level, but very large of people coming to listen to this. People wanted to bring their kids to it, and people's lives were changed. I mentioned before about Jim Bob Duggar talking about his life was changed at one of these things. And so a lot of people had that same experience. They went there and they listened to what he had to say, and he's talking through how to live life as a Christian, how to handle different things. We'll talk about during the teachings more what those teachings were. But it was, how to think about things through life and that sort of thing. And all the while saying, this is what the Bible says about stuff.
Right.
And we'll discuss that in more details of what it says or doesn't say, but this is what he said. This is the Bible says about stuff. So where do we go next?
Eventually this grew to, tens of thousands of people at each seminar rather than just a few hundred, right? I mean, it quickly grew and was attended by the masses.
And this was still, for a while, it was still mostly about bringing in the youth, bringing in young people to learn this. As they were growing through the 70s, and even into the 80s, we're going to kind of go back and forth on our timeline a little bit here. They started opening regional offices in different parts of the country because they would have this seminar and then they would offer more things. They started offering training centers, kind of expanding upon the principles that they learned in the seminar. And it's very important. I pointed this out earlier. They were not part of a specific denomination or a specific church. They weren't having Sunday worship services.
Right.
This was all about learning, Bible studies, studies on topical studies, that sort of thing. And so lots of churches incorporated some of their materials, bought their materials, promoted their materials, etc. On this. And just in full disclaimer, as I've studied some of this, I've found that I've been part of churches who have used some of these materials. Some of these materials I've been looking into since I've been looking at some of the materials. I'm quite familiar with a lot of it because I've seen this, been taught this, and been through some of these classes, not even knowing it was Institute for Basic Life Principles.
Right.
I've seen these illustrations and some of the videos they offer and things.
I was going to say, now that you mention it, I feel like I've seen their logo on some of the things that I did in youth.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I haven't taught a lesson from this, probably.
Right.
That's a possibility too. So I've definitely seen this, and so they kind of got integrated into a lot of different churches with that on there. And then, so tell us what happened in 1973, because I think that was pretty important.
So in 73, they decided to hold a national advanced seminar specifically for pastors. Right.
So they're going past young people. Now they're talking to the pastors, to the leaders of these churches.
Right, so that they can then go and lead within their own churches and teach this basic principles, concept, and this idea to their own flocks. So
with doing that, with kind of expanding that, in 74, they changed the name to Basic Youth Conflicts, or Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts. And that's because their ministry kind of changed. They went beyond the college campuses, and they went really to targeting youth, in churches all over the country. They realized they really kind of changed a little bit. So that's why it became an institute in Basic Youth Conflicts. Thoughts?
Yep. And no, because I my thoughts are not together on that. But they changed their name several times. And
they did, and we're going to get to the next name change.
There have been other groups that we've talked about that changed their name several times as well, and that had meaning behind it. So I almost wonder if there was additional meaning here. I'll look at that in the teachings side of things.
Yeah, and some groups changed their name to run from something. I think that doesn't seem to be the case here. I haven't found yet any evidence of that. They were getting more and more popular.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it was
point in their ministry.
We saw that with the CSA, right? The Covenant, the Sword, the Arm of the Lord, where they changed their name several times. Part of it was running from something. Part of it was, following just the winds of the 60s and 70s and all the religious things that were going on. So it does have me thinking, and I'll do some more digging.
Okay.
But in 84, so 10 years later, so they've been doing this for 10 years as Basic Youth Conflict Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts. Wow, that's hard to say.
Yeah.
And then in 84, they started the Advanced Training Institute of America, specifically for homeschoolers.
So that's ATI.
With 102 families. Yeah.
So we know people who are ATI families. Probably. I know I do. I don't know if you do, but I'm betting you do.
I was going to say, I probably do. Yeah.
So they came out with a curriculum focused on the Sermon on the Mount, whole curriculum, K through 12, on a homeschool curriculum. And yes, they use the Sermon on the Mount as their main basis of it. They use other scripture and other things. They've got a lot of criticism over the years over that curriculum, because that curriculum had some fairly controversial things in it. And we can talk about more of that in the teachings. One thing I wanted to mention here was that it has changed over the years. They've changed some of the controversial things. And and just even before things were necessarily controversial, they've changed the curriculum over time.
Yeah.
Like any curriculum. But it's got some very odd things in it, and it's also gotten criticism for maybe not being as educational as it should have been. You know?
Right.
Maybe not teaching the basics of education as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of sitting here thinking, I could teach a lot from the Sermon on the Mount, but I don't think I could teach 13 years worth of school from that.
Well, they take some real stretches. We'll get into that in the teachings part for sure. So they started ATI, and a lot of people interchange ATI with IBLP.
Mm-hmm.
They really do. Because that's synonymous. And that was a huge growth period for them. You said it started with 102 families, followed by thousands more. That was a huge growth thing. One, homeschooling was becoming more popular as we went through this period of mandated schooling. More states had opened up and allowed homeschooling to happen in a more or less regimented way. Texas famously doesn't have a lot of regulations on homeschooling. There are some other states. Some states are very regulated with it. So it got to be a more popular thing. Culture was changing a lot. And so a lot of Christians were because the culture around them was changing, was finding it harder and harder to raise children in public schools and still teach them the Christian principles they wanted to teach them because they felt like the schools weren't teaching them those principles.
Right.
Totally get that. You know, my kid's been to both public and non-public schools. I totally understand that. But so this was a popular thing. Not the only group to do that. There's another group right here near where I live that does exactly this sort of thing. That's very popular. And I also know people who've used their curriculum. But anyway, so that was a big thing in 1984. 1989, what I was going to get to was they name changed again.
Right.
That's when they went to the Institute in Basic Life Principles.
Yep.
And again, this was expanding the ministry. The scope and everything kind of changes, more focus on the entire family, not just the youth. They'd brought in this homeschooling thing. This wasn't just teaching the young people how to live. This was teaching the whole family. They went more into parenting. This is when they started, before 89, but this was symbolizing that they had done this. They went into the Pearls book on parenting. That's something we need to talk about in the teachings, by the way. I'll need to go share a link to that because that's very integrated into what they teach. Michael Pearl or something. I'll have to look up the names. The Pearl's book on parenting. That's not the name of the book, but Pearl is the author.
Okay.
That's very important because they went real heavy to spare the rod and spoil the child, like super heavy. They started using actual rods and encouraging families to do that. In the 90s, they started the youth retreats as training centers. So they'd already had some training centers, but here they really started doing these training centers all over.
Yeah.
In the 90s, they were kind of all over every place.
They were everywhere. Yep.
Quite a few. Famously, with the Duggars, their oldest son, Josh, was sent to one of these training centers after he had molested his sisters and some other girls. And instead of any legal action or any counseling or real help happening, he was just sent to one of these training centers, famously. Right. Since he's now in prison for child pornography, that probably didn't seem to work very well. And that's what's brought this to the light.
The text. Yeah, you learn the text, not the Bible itself. Sorry.
It didn't seem to help him with that. And the reason I bring that up is because that's what was brought up in the Happy Shining People, and other people have seen that.
Yeah.
But also I bring it up because that is kind of how they were, we're going to make your children better people. And this is where a lot of what we're going to talk about, the controversies that come up later, a lot of the allegations of abuse and things that have happened in these places.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yep. So also in the 90s, right, they began their global outreach, right? They started doing seminars in 1990 in New Zealand. In 91, they started seminars in Russia. 93 in Australia. 95 in Taiwan.
So 91 in Russia is very important because it became Russia instead of the Soviet Union.
Right. That was just after the fall.
Yeah. And the church was illegal before that. So that's very interesting that they got in there right at that time.
Yeah.
In the early 2000s, they started expanding the youth retreats and the family conferences. Another Duggar reference is they did an episode of their show where they went to an AIT event where everybody kind of camps out and they all stayed in a big camper thing. And everybody has these big community get together and camping, and they go do, the kids get to do events and learn stuff, and the parents do events and seminars. They started really expanding that. In 2014, Gothard resigned.
Yep. And Tim Lewandowski took over.
So again, we're going to go more into why, but Gothard resigned because not one, not two, but lots and lots and lots of young people came forward that he had touched them inappropriately, that he was grooming them, that he had molested them.
Right.
And he was not convicted of such. I'll mention that. There's probably multiple reasons for that, and we'll go into that. But he was accused by a lot of people.
Yep.
And that was happening at these, youth retreats and family conferences. It's happening mostly at their headquarters, where he would literally go to a family and say, "Hey, your 14-year-old daughter should come work at headquarters. The Lord could really use her here."
Yep.
And
you're getting into the next episode, Matt.
Sorry.
It's the next episode.
But so Gothard resigned. Yeah. He was basically made to resign. And in 2016, they relocated to Big Sandy, Texas. As far as I can tell,
outside of Tyler,
they closed most of the other locations and sites around the country. I don't know if the organization got smaller at all. I think the organization probably has expanded. But they have got a huge thing in Big Sandy where they do all these seminars and youth retreats, family camping. They do a lot of stuff in Big Sandy.
If I remember in some of the reading, they took over like an old college campus, right? Like, I mean, it's like the whole thing. I mean, it's massive.
Huge. Yeah, it's huge. They got many acres out there. So that is their expansion and growth.
Yeah. And they've, they're still going, right? They're still there, still going strong.
They still exist as an organization without Bill Gothard.
Yep.
They've made some changes and things, some of the controversies that had come up with him. And they're still around, and a lot of churches are still working with them. A lot of people are going, they're having retreats out this weekend.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So that covers, expansion and growth. So next time we're going to talk about the notable events and some of the controversies. Sound fun?
All righty. See you then.